Catherine Kate Morrison was 31 years old when she began excavating a large underground storage chamber into the hillside behind her Kansas Territory homestead in September of 1876, and every neighbor who passed by assumed she was building a root cellar until she started stacking cord after cord of split firewood inside it. "She's storing firewood underground like it's potatoes," they would say to each other with bemused laughter. "Everyone knows firewood needs to be stored above ground, where air can circulate. That wood is going to rot into useless mush within a year. The poor woman clearly doesn't understand basic wood storage." That is, by the autumn of 1879, 3 years later, those same neighbors were standing inside Kate's underground dugout in complete amazement, examining firewood that was still perfectly dry and ready to burn, while their own above-ground supplies from the same harvest year had rotted into worthless, moisture-logged waste. Kate had arrived in the Kansas Territory in the spring of 1874 with her husband Robert, and together they had established a successful homestead on a quarter-section claim near the settlement of Junction City. Robert had been a timber merchant back in Ohio, and he had taught Kate everything he knew about wood properties, seasoning and storage during their first 2 years on the frontier. Robert died in August of 1876 from a farming accident when his wagon overturned while hauling a load of freshly cut logs. His death left Kate widowed at 31, with a productive homestead, a solid cabin, and most importantly, an encyclopedic knowledge of wood science that Robert had spent years teaching her. "Wood is more complicated than most people realize," he had told her countless times. "Understanding moisture, airflow, and decomposition is what separates someone who has firewood from someone who has a rotting pile of useless sticks." After Robert's death, Kate continued managing the homestead on her own, proving to the skeptical community that a woman could indeed run a successful farm independently. But during the late summer of 1876, as she was cutting and stacking firewood for the coming winter, she began thinking seriously about a problem that Robert had often complained about but had never fully solved: the challenge of long-term firewood storage on the humid Kansas prairie. The conventional approach to firewood storage that everyone in the territory used was simple and seemingly logical. You would cut your wood in late summer, split it to speed the drying process, and then stack it in covered rows outside your cabin. The roof over the stack, usually a simple wooden frame with shakes or canvas, would protect the wood from direct rain and snow. The open sides would allow air to circulate through the stack, supposedly drying the wood and keeping it from rotting. This approach worked adequately for short-term storage of a single winter's supply. You would cut your wood in September, stack it under cover, and burn it through the winter months from November to March. By the time spring arrived, you would have used up most of your supply, and any remaining wood would be cleared out to make room for the next year's cutting. But Kate had been thinking about a different approach, one that Robert had discussed theoretically, but had never attempted. What if, instead of cutting just 1 year's supply at a time, you could cut multiple years' worth of firewood during a single productive season and store it for the long term? This would have several advantages. You could take advantage of particularly good conditions for cutting, a year when dead-standing timber was abundant, or when you had extra help available, or when weather was ideal. You could season your wood for multiple years, creating fuel that was exceptionally dry and efficient. And perhaps most importantly, you would have a substantial reserve supply for emergencies or difficult years when cutting fresh wood might not be possible. The problem with this idea was obvious to anyone who understood wood science. Firewood stored above ground in the humid Kansas climate would not last for multiple years. Even under the best covered storage, moisture from the ground and from the humid air would gradually penetrate the wood over time. After 2 or 3 years, even wood that had started out properly seasoned would become moisture-logged and begin rotting. The conventional wisdom was clear. Wood needed to be used within 1 year of cutting, 2 years at the absolute maximum under ideal conditions. But Kate had an idea that challenged this conventional wisdom, an idea based on something Robert had once observed during their journey west. They had stopped at a homestead in Missouri, where the owner had shown them an underground storage pit he had dug for keeping seed potatoes through the winter. The pit was carved into a hillside, about 8 feet deep, with a dirt floor and earth walls on 3 sides. A heavy wooden door sealed the entrance. What had struck Robert at the time was how perfectly dry the interior of that storage pit had been, even though it was underground and surrounded by earth. The earth itself is acting as insulation, Robert had explained to Kate. The stable temperature underground prevents the extreme swings between wet and dry that happen above ground. And as long as you have proper drainage and ventilation, underground storage can actually be drier than above-ground storage because you're not exposed to rain, snow, and humid air. Kate had remembered that conversation, and now she wondered if the same principle could apply to firewood storage. What if she dug a large underground chamber, properly designed with drainage and ventilation, and stored multiple years' worth of firewood inside it? The stable underground environment might actually preserve the wood better than conventional above-ground storage, protecting it from the moisture and rot that destroyed wood left outside for multiple years. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the idea was worth attempting. The initial labor would be substantial. Excavating a large underground chamber would be weeks of hard work. But if it succeeded, she would create a storage system that could hold multiple years' worth of firewood in perfect condition, giving her a level of security and efficiency that no other homesteader in the territory possessed. In early September of 1876, Kate began the excavation project. She selected a location on the hillside about 50 feet behind her cabin, where the slope was gentle enough for easy access, but steep enough to provide good natural drainage away from the chamber. The soil was primarily clay, with some sand mixed in, stable enough to hold its shape when carved, but not so rocky that digging would be impossibly difficult. She marked out the dimensions of the chamber she wanted to create: 16 feet wide, 24 feet deep, and 10 feet high at the center. This would give her a storage space of approximately 3,800 cubic feet. Since a standard cord of firewood occupies 128 cubic feet, her chamber would theoretically be able to hold about 30 cords of firewood, enough for roughly 5 years of heating if she burned about 6 cords per winter. The excavation process was brutal physical labor that consumed most of September and extended into early October, requiring levels of sustained physical effort that would have broken most people. Kate would rise at 4:30 each morning before the sun had fully risen, and after a quick breakfast of bread and coffee, she would be at the hillside worksite by 5 o'clock, ready to begin another day of digging. The Kansas clay soil was dense and stubborn, not the loose sandy earth that could be moved quickly with a shovel. Each shovelful required significant effort, and most of the work actually involved the pickaxe rather than the shovel. She would swing the heavy pick in a controlled arc, driving the pointed end into the clay face to break up the compacted earth. After 3 or 4 strikes in the same area, the clay would finally fracture and loosen enough that she could insert the shovel and actually remove the material. The physical toll was cumulative and relentless. The first day of excavation, she managed to remove about 6 cubic yards of earth, a respectable amount that left her tired but satisfied. The second day, her shoulders were already sore from the unaccustomed motion of swinging the pickaxe, and she managed only 5 cubic yards. By the end of the first week, her hands were covered in blisters that had formed, broken, and were forming again as calluses. She developed a systematic routine to make the work as efficient as possible. She would start each morning by loosening a section of the clay face with the pickaxe, perhaps an hour of steady striking, creating a pile of broken clay fragments at her feet. Then she would switch to the shovel, loading the loosened material into her wheelbarrow. Each wheelbarrow load held about 2 cubic feet of earth and weighed approximately 100 pounds. She would push the heavy barrow out of the excavation, down the hillside, and spread the earth in areas of her property where she wanted to level the ground or improve drainage. In the early stages of excavation, when she was just cutting into the hillside face, the haul distance was short, maybe 20 feet from the working face to where she could dump the earth. But as the chamber extended deeper into the hillside, the haul distance grew longer. By the time she had penetrated 15 feet into the earth, she was pushing each wheelbarrow load nearly 40 feet through the dark tunnel before reaching the entrance where she could tip it out and spread the soil. The deeper sections of excavation presented unique challenges. Working in the confined space of the tunnel, with only lantern light to see by, she had to be constantly aware of her surroundings to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling or stumbling over the uneven floor. The air in the deeper sections became stale and difficult to breathe, forcing her to take more frequent breaks to come outside for fresh air. By the end of the second week, she had penetrated about 12 feet into the hillside and had removed approximately 60 cubic yards of earth, roughly 80 tons of material that she had personally loosened with the pick, shoveled into the barrow, hauled out of the tunnel, and spread around her property. Her body had adapted to the work to some degree. The initial soreness in her shoulders and back had settled into a constant dull ache that she learned to ignore, and her hands had developed thick calluses that protected against new blisters. But the psychological challenge was in some ways harder than the physical effort. Day after day of the same monotonous task: strike with the pick, shovel the fragments, load the barrow, push it out, dump it, return for another load. Hour after hour, with no one to talk to and nothing to break the routine, except the gradual, almost imperceptible progress of the tunnel extending deeper into the earth. She sustained herself through this period by focusing on her vision of what this space would become. When her arms were shaking with fatigue from swinging the pickaxe, she would visualize walking into the completed chamber and seeing cords of perfectly dry firewood stacked along the walls, protected from weather and ready to burn for years to come. When her back was aching from pushing heavy wheelbarrow loads, she would imagine the satisfaction of proving all of her skeptical neighbors wrong, of demonstrating that careful planning and scientific principles could create something better than conventional wisdom had thought possible. By late September, she had excavated to the full 24-foot depth of the chamber, creating a tunnel that extended straight back into the hillside like a mine shaft. She had removed approximately 120 cubic yards of earth total, roughly 160 tons of material moved by hand over 4 weeks of sustained labor. As she dug deeper into the hillside, Kate had to begin installing timber supports to prevent cave-ins. She used heavy cedar posts salvaged from an old barn that Robert had dismantled before his death, setting vertical supports every 6 feet along the walls and installing horizontal beams across the top to support the earth ceiling. These timber frames would bear the weight of the soil above and prevent any dangerous collapses. By late September, she had excavated to the full 24-foot depth of the chamber. Now came the critical work of shaping the space and making it suitable for long-term storage. She carefully carved the ceiling into a gentle barrel vault rather than leaving it flat. Robert had taught her that an arched ceiling distributes the weight of the earth above more evenly, making underground structures more stable. She worked on smoothing the walls and floor, creating surfaces that were as regular as possible. The floor she carved slightly lower in the center than at the edges, creating a subtle drainage channel. Any water that might seep into the chamber would flow to this central channel and then drain toward the entrance, rather than pooling anywhere inside the storage space. For ventilation, Kate cut 2 shafts extending from the chamber up through the hillside to emerge as small openings on the surface. One shaft was positioned at the back of the chamber near the ceiling, and the other was near the floor at the front. This arrangement would create natural air circulation. Cool air would enter through the lower opening, warm slightly as it passed through the chamber, and exit through the upper opening. The circulation would be gentle and constant, preventing stale air buildup without creating drafts that might bring in moisture. She lined these ventilation shafts with stones to prevent collapse and covered the surface openings with flat rocks positioned to allow airflow while keeping out rain, snow, and animals. The entrance to the chamber was the most important element for protecting the stored firewood. Kate built a proper door frame using heavy timbers, setting it into the hillside opening with careful attention to creating a weather-tight seal. The door itself she constructed from 3-inch thick oak planks, bolted together horizontally, creating a solid barrier that would seal the chamber against exterior weather. She hung the door on massive iron strap hinges and positioned it to swing outward, so that snow accumulation in winter wouldn't block it closed from the inside. Around the entire doorframe, she carefully packed clay mixed with straw to create a sealed joint between the timber and the surrounding earth, preventing any air or water infiltration. By mid-October, the underground storage chamber was complete. From the outside, only the heavy wooden door set into the hillside revealed that this was a human-made structure. The ventilation openings on the surface were small and easily overlooked. To a casual observer, the hillside looked essentially unchanged, except for that single door. Kate spent the rest of October and the first week of November cutting, splitting, and hauling firewood to fill her new underground storage. She worked from dawn to dusk, processing the abundant dead-standing timber on her property. She focused on oak and hickory, hardwoods that burned hot and long, cutting each tree into 16-inch lengths and splitting the pieces to approximately 4-inch diameter. She used a travois pulled by her horse to haul the split wood from the cutting areas to the storage chamber. Each load could carry about half a cord, and she made trip after trip, gradually filling the underground space. She stacked the wood carefully inside the chamber, leaving gaps between the pieces for air circulation and building the stacks away from the walls to prevent any contact with earth that might transfer moisture. By mid-November, she had stored approximately 20 cords of firewood in the underground chamber, more than 3 years' worth of fuel. The chamber still had room for more, but she decided to leave some space for future additions. She sealed the heavy oak door and turned her attention to preparing for the coming winter. When Kate's neighbors first learned about her underground firewood storage project, the reactions were universally negative. Samuel Fletcher, who owned the adjacent property, stopped by in late October while she was still loading wood into the chamber. "Kate, what are you doing with all that firewood?" he asked, watching her wheel another load through the door. "That's an awful lot of wood for one winter, and why are you storing it underground?" "I'm storing multiple years' worth," Kate explained. "This chamber will hold about 20 cords, which will last me 3 to 4 years. The underground environment will keep it dry and well-preserved." Fletcher looked at her with a mixture of concern and condescension. "Kate, I don't think you understand how wood storage works. Firewood needs to be kept above ground where air can circulate around it. If you store it underground, it's going to absorb moisture from the earth and rot. Within a year, all of that wood you're working so hard to stack will be worthless mush." "Actually, the underground environment should be more stable," Kate replied. "The earth maintains a constant temperature and protects the wood from rain, snow, and humid air. As long as I have good ventilation and drainage, the wood should stay drier than it would above ground." Fletcher shook his head firmly. "That's not how it works. I've been farming in Kansas for 10 years, and I can tell you that anything organic stored underground will rot. That's just basic common sense. Wood belongs above ground where it can breathe. You're wasting a lot of hard work on wood that's going to be ruined." Martha Peterson, another neighbor, visited in early November and was even more critical. "Kate, people in town are talking about your underground firewood cave," she said bluntly. They're worried that you're not thinking clearly since Robert died. Storing firewood underground is such an obviously bad idea that folks are wondering if grief is affecting your judgment. Have you considered that maybe you should ask for advice from more experienced homesteaders before you do something this foolish? Kate felt her patience wearing thin, but kept her voice level. Mrs. Peterson, I appreciate your concern, but my judgment is perfectly sound. I'm applying principles that Robert taught me about wood science and underground storage. This isn't foolishness. It's a carefully planned experiment in long-term storage. But Peterson was not convinced, and neither was anyone else in the community. Over the following weeks, Kate became aware that her underground firewood folly had become a popular topic of conversation and mockery. Some people expressed genuine concern about her mental state. Others simply laughed at what they saw as an obvious mistake born of ignorance. A few of the men in the community even made bets about how long it would take for the stored wood to rot into useless garbage. Through the winter of 1876 to 77, Kate burned approximately 6 cords of firewood from her underground storage. Each time she needed wood, she would walk to the hillside, open the heavy door, and enter the chamber to gather an armload. The wood she retrieved was consistently dry and ready to burn, showing no signs of moisture absorption or deterioration. The following spring, when Kate opened the storage chamber for a thorough inspection, she found that the remaining 14 cords of wood were still in excellent condition. The pieces felt dry to the touch, showed no signs of mold or rot, and smelled fresh and clean rather than musty or damp. The ventilation system was working exactly as she had designed it, maintaining fresh air circulation without allowing moisture to accumulate. In the fall of 1877, Kate added another 6 cords of freshly cut and split firewood to the chamber, bringing her total storage back up to 20 cords. The year-old wood that had been stored underground for a full year was actually drier than the freshly cut wood, having continued to season in the stable underground environment. Through the winter of 1877 to 78, she again burned approximately 6 cords, and the pattern continued. Each spring, she would inspect the storage and find the wood in excellent condition. Each fall, she would add fresh wood to replenish what she had burned. The underground chamber was functioning exactly as she had hoped, maintaining her wood in perfect dry condition year after year. Her neighbors, meanwhile, were experiencing the typical problems with conventional above-ground storage. Wood that had been cut and stacked in 1876 was showing serious deterioration by 1878. Even wood stored under good roofs was absorbing moisture from the ground and from the humid Kansas air, gradually becoming waterlogged and beginning to rot. By the 3rd year, most of the wood from that original cutting was unusable, too wet to burn efficiently, with visible rot and mold growth. The conventional wisdom held that this was simply how firewood worked. You cut what you needed for 1 year, maybe 2 at most, and then you cut fresh wood again. Long-term storage was considered impossible. Wood would inevitably rot if kept for multiple years, but Kate's underground stored wood was defying this conventional wisdom. By the fall of 1879, she still had wood in her chamber that had been cut in the fall of 1876, 3 full years earlier, and that wood was still perfectly dry and ready to burn. In November of 1879, Samuel Fletcher stopped by Kate's homestead with a request that surprised her. "Kate, I've heard that you still have wood from 3 years ago that's still good," he said with obvious skepticism. "People are saying it, but I don't believe it. Would you mind if I take a look at your storage?" "Of course not," Kate replied. "Come with me." They walked to the hillside, and Kate opened the heavy door. They stepped inside the underground chamber, and Kate lit a lantern to illuminate the space. The chamber was about half full, with approximately 10 cords of wood stacked neatly in rows, with air gaps between the pieces. Fletcher walked around the space, examining the wood carefully. He picked up pieces at random, checking their weight and moisture level by feel. He checked the walls and floor for signs of dampness. He even sniffed the air in the chamber, expecting to detect mustiness or rot. After several minutes of thorough inspection, he turned to Kate with an expression of complete astonishment. "This is impossible," he said flatly. "This wood feels dry, not just acceptable, actually dry. Some of this has been here for 3 years." "That stack along the back wall," Kate said, pointing. "That's all from 1876, 3 years old, and it's still perfectly good." Fletcher walked to the back and examined the 3-year-old wood more closely. He picked up a split piece of oak, hefted it to judge its weight, tapped it against another piece to hear the solid sound that dry wood makes, and even tried to bend it slightly to test its strength. "I don't understand this at all," he admitted. "Everything I know about wood storage says this shouldn't be possible. Wood stored for 3 years should be rotten mush, but this wood is dry and solid. How is this happening?" Kate explained the principles she had applied. The underground environment is more stable than above ground. The temperature stays relatively constant year-round, which prevents the moisture cycles that cause rot. The earth walls protect the wood from rain and snow. The ventilation system prevents stale air and moisture buildup without creating drafts that would bring in humid outside air, and the drainage in the floor channels any seepage away before it can affect the wood. Fletcher shook his head slowly. "I mocked you when you built this. I told everyone you were wasting your time and that the wood would rot. I was completely wrong, and I apologize. This is the most impressive wood storage I've ever seen." Word of Fletcher's visit and his shocked reaction spread quickly through the community. Within days, other neighbors started asking if they could visit Kate's underground storage to see this phenomenon for themselves. Some came out of genuine curiosity, while others came because they simply couldn't believe the stories and needed to verify them with their own eyes. Martha Peterson visited with her husband George, and both of them emerged from the underground chamber looking stunned. "We've been replacing our entire firewood supply every year because anything we don't use rots by the next season," Martha said quietly. "You have wood that's 3 years old and still perfect. Do you realize what this means? You can cut wood during good years and have it available for bad years. You never have to worry about having enough time or good weather to cut each year's supply. This is revolutionary." By early December of 1879, Kate's underground firewood storage had become a local attraction. People would ride for miles to see the woman who kept perfectly dry firewood underground for years. Some came seeking detailed advice about building their own underground storage chambers. Others came simply out of scientific curiosity about this practical application of principles that contradicted conventional wisdom. Thomas Whitfield, a farmer from the next county over, visited in mid-December with a notebook full of questions. "I need to understand exactly how this works," he explained. "I'm tired of the constant cycle of cutting wood every single year. If I could build a storage chamber like this and stock it with 4 or 5 years' worth of wood, I could cut firewood only in years when conditions are ideal. But I need to understand the principles so I can replicate it successfully." Kate spent 3 hours with Whitfield, explaining every detail of the construction and the reasoning behind each design element. She showed him how to select the proper location for good drainage, how deep to excavate to reach stable earth temperature, how to design the ventilation system for air circulation without moisture infiltration, how to seal the entrance to prevent weather penetration, and how to stack the wood inside for maximum preservation. "The most important thing to understand," Kate emphasized, "is that you're creating a stable environment that's isolated from the weather extremes and moisture cycles of the surface. The earth itself is protecting the wood, and the ventilation is just enough to prevent stale air without introducing humidity." "Udu, Over the course of that winter and the following spring, 12 families in the surrounding area built their own versions of Kate's underground firewood storage, following her instructions and adapting the design to their particular locations and needs. The designs varied. Some people built smaller chambers for 2 or 3 years' supply, while others built larger spaces matching Kate's capacity. Some incorporated their chambers into natural hillsides like Kate had, while others excavated into flat ground and mounded earth over the top to create artificial hills. The results were universally successful. Every family reported the same experience. Firewood stored underground remained dry and well preserved for multiple years, while wood stored conventionally above ground deteriorated within 2 years at most. The contrast was stark and undeniable, and it fundamentally changed how people in the region thought about firewood management. The local newspaper sent a correspondent to interview Kate and document her storage chamber in March of 1880. The resulting article, titled "Underground Wood Storage Preserves Fuel for Years," explained the principles of stable earth temperature and moisture control, and predicted that this approach might become standard practice as settlers learned to plan for long-term resource security rather than living year to year. Kate lived on her homestead for another 28 years, eventually remarrying in 1884 to a widower named Eric Larson, who was impressed by both her practical innovation and her independent spirit. Together, they expanded her underground storage concept, eventually creating 3 connected chambers that could hold up to 40 cords of firewood, nearly a decade's supply maintained in perfect condition. She lived until 1904, dying at the age of 59. Her obituary in the Junction City newspaper specifically mentioned the famous underground firewood storage that had made her a local legend and had inspired dozens of similar constructions throughout the county and beyond. Modern understanding of wood science confirms the principles that Kate discovered through practical application and Robert's theoretical knowledge. Wood deteriorates through exposure to repeated moisture cycles and temperature swings that encourage fungal growth and bacterial decomposition. By storing wood in an environment with stable temperature and controlled moisture, protected from rain, snow, and humid air while maintaining gentle ventilation, decomposition can be dramatically slowed or even essentially halted. Contemporary long-term wood storage facilities use similar principles, though with modern materials and climate control technology. The fundamental concept remains unchanged. Create a stable environment that protects wood from the moisture and temperature extremes that cause deterioration. The story is about a widow who applied scientific principles to challenge conventional wisdom, who endured mockery from neighbors who couldn't imagine that their common-sense assumptions might be wrong, and who proved through actual results that careful observation and logical thinking can reveal solutions that seem impossible to conventional thinking. Because sometimes the best way to preserve something isn't to expose it to air, but to protect it from variable conditions. Sometimes underground storage is drier than above-ground storage. Sometimes conventional wisdom is based on incomplete understanding rather than on actual scientific principle. And sometimes the person everyone laughs at for hiding firewood in the ground proves that innovation means questioning the assumptions everyone else takes for granted.